20th century literature is studied in two distinct phases. The first phase begins with the passing of various reform acts such as Universal Education Act, Third Reform Act and the Country Councils Act. This phase starts from 1880 and continues till 1930, the year of the Great Economic Depression. This phase is labeled as the modern phase. The second phase begins around 1950, and this phase is termed as the post-modern phase. This lesson deals with the modern phase in literature. The temper which the adjective Victorian described was virtually finished by 1880. The works of some of the great Victorians like Matthew Arnold, Thomas Hardy, John Ruskin exposed the hollowness of a society dominated by aristocrats and bourgeois values. As a matter of fact, what actually came to be labeled as modernism began as a revolt against bourgeois values in France, Victorian attitudes in England, and Puritanism and materialism in the United States of America. Before an analysis is made to understand the complexities of the modern literature, it is essential to understand its background, because background forms an essential part of foreground. No writer can remain aloof from his environment. The race, the milieu, and the moment always determine the mood and complexion of literature and make a given period different from any other period before or after. So if we want to understand the real ethos of 20th century literature, we first have to be acquainted with all those factors which determined its tone and complexion. Between 1870 and the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, we witness a major transformation of the forms, the spirit, and the nature of arts. The transformation was the result of some social, political, and economic factors. In the Victorian era, that starts from 1837, when the Queen Victoria ascended the throne, and 1901, there was a rapid economic and social change. England became the leading industrial power, but the industrialization was unregulated. Social stress, turbulence, and anxiety increased. There was deterioration of rural England. With the growth of urbanization, poverty and slums multiplied. From 1870 to 1902, England suffered worst agricultural depression, which continued for 30 long years. Landed aristocracy and agricultural labor was hit hard, and the result was the end of rural England. The end of Boer Wars revealed the oppression of British imperialism and punctured its complacency. Besides decline in birth rate, increase in migration, enlarged role of money, ethics of competition, the entry of the other European nations into the world markets challenged English industrial supremacy and reduced her margins of profit. It became clear that the British Empire was no longer a monolithic structure. In every area, in social expectations, scientific awareness, religious and moral values, there came to be seen a major upheaval. Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, published in 1859, threatened the citadels of orthodox Christianity and prepared the way for an attitude which was to be critical of the whole social and moral order. Darwinian revolution dethroned man as the crown of creation. Individual is merely a speck in the historical sweep of biological changes. Man is not the highest mammal even. Man is just a transitional figure in an evolutionary process. Several other scientific discoveries worked together to remake man's vision of himself. Three important influences which changed man's view of himself in relation to society, in relation to his own mind, and in relation to universe are Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein. Karl Marx was highly critical of capitalist system and believed that a small number of capitalists appropriate the benefits of improved industrial methods, while the laboring classes are left in increasing dependency and misery. His works like Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital changed radically the views about man in society. The old socio-economic order suffered a transformation with the spread of Marx's theory of social change. His revolutionary ideas exerted a considerable influence on literature. In 1900, Sigmund Freud published his Interpretation of Dreams, one of the most profoundly influential books of the 20th century. Freud's theory of psyche in terms of a duality, ego and the id, transformed the idea of character and personality. Freud's theory that man is not what he appears to be, rather below the sane mind there lies a swamp of irrational motives involving sex, parental authority, fixations, repressions, the whole paraphernalia of the unconscious, gave freedom to the literary artists for the new ways of describing human behavior. Freud changed the idea of man in relation to his own mind. Freud's theories revealed that man's own mind was awesome and frightening. Albert Einstein also proved that man could no longer see the objective reality with any clarity because of the unsureness of his own senses. According to Einstein, man distorts reality in the very process of observing it. As man's perception of actual phenomena is not reliable, he must recognize that his world is based on a mathematical system which is merely symbolic of things and cannot be visualized or observed. As a result of Einstein's theory of relativity, all things hitherto seen as fixed and stable are now seen and observed in relation to other things. Einstein's theory of relativity underlined the position of man in the universe. Einstein demonstrated that the external universe was mysterious and terrifying, where nothing was constant except flux, nothing fixed except the law of relativity, and nothing determinable except the principle of indeterminacy. Some other major influences which shaped the complexion of modern literature include the works of Carl Gustav Jung, Henry Bergson, and William James. Carl Gustav Jung developed his theory of the collective unconscious based upon the evidence provided by mythology and by the dreams and fantasies of his patients, which seemed to derive from the common experience of primitive society rather than from the personal experience of the individual. In this theory, we can discover the origin of neurosis and myth. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, emphasized the merging of time, which was to influence the 20th century literature in a big way. According to Bergson, time is heterogeneous, always in motion, fluid, ever shifting. Through his concept of time known as la durée, duration or psychological time, Bergson asserted a disbelief in the surface reality of life and stressed a time in which the clock is artificial and mental time is natural. Bergson's idea of reality conceived the world as a flux of interpenetrated elements which cannot be comprehended by the intellect. The anti-mechanical mode of thinking places all time, all the past, as well as the present moment in one concentrated now. Bergson emphasized the role of intuition rather than reason in human life and stressed the fundamental role played by memory and inner time in our apprehension of reality. William James, in his book The Principles of Psychology, emphasized that reality is not an objective given. Reality is subjective and reality is perceived through consciousness. As a result of the social, political and economic compulsions and explosion of knowledge, the 20th century literature reveals a shift in sensibility. As a result, we see the establishment of various societies and groups like the Fabian Society and the Bloomsbury Group. The establishment of the Fabian Society, an organization of intellectuals, preached doctrinaire socialism under the leadership of Sidney Webb and Bernard Shaw. The Fabian Society was committed to social amelioration. First pamphlets were written to lobby for the creation of the National Health Service in 1911, minimum wages in 1906, the abolition of hereditary peers in 1917. The society criticized free trade. It embraced protectionism in the interests of protecting the state from foreign competition. The Bloomsbury Group, a group of intellectuals and men of letters, opposed to the hypocritical shams and traditions, stood against the bourgeois standards. The result in literature came in the form of avant-garde trends. The term avant-garde suggests that the new arts were a military or political operation. The avant-garde artists rejected the corrupted state of contemporary bourgeois culture, the smug values of a commercial materialism and imperial society, and the middle brow and reassuring tradition of its arts. The chief task of the artist in any age is to recreate for his age the image of man. The First World War from 1914 to 1918 initiated the dissolution of the familiar boundaries and resulted in utter disillusionment, morbid and sordid state of despair, disintegration of moral and social codes of society. It isolated man from man and further isolated man from society. So the modernists were simply trying to define in creative terms the 20th century man in the 20th century world. And the new image of man had to be fashioned in the light of the radically new thinking about the human condition. In the year 1910, the exhibition of post-impressionist art in the Grafton Galleries in London opened new vistas of creativity. The modernist revolution, which was the handiwork of an international, Inter-Arts Alliance, which began in Paris, soon became international in character and multifaceted in nature. Painting, music, sculpture, and literature drew inspiration from the entire artistic heritage of the human race over the centuries. The impact could be seen in the literature produced in England during this time. The beginning of the new traditions are marked by discovery, dissent, and freedom from past, with emphasis on make it new. The old forms had to be dismantled, undermined, and reconstructed. The artist was no longer a bourgeois moralist. Rather, he was an independent instrument of discovery, a bearer of creative evolution. And the language of a plain and direct realism no longer expressed a sufficient sense of the shifting, moving, speeding, complex world. Art was no longer a matter of representing the social facts of an agreed world outside. It instead expressed itself, its own methods of composition, its own processes of perception and intuition. Art became a symbol for its own existence, and the symbol grew more obscure, enigmatic, and labyrinthine. So, new literary and poetic messages were inevitable, and the idea of new arts grew. There are numerous and frantic experiments with new techniques of expression, and the great works of art produced during this time deal with the themes of nostalgia, self-irony, perversity, challenge to belief, a desire to shock, an attempt to make it new. Radical experimentation in technique, a return to new classicism, an extension of new romanticism in a new context, an unsparing naturalism, an endeavor to go beyond realism, surrealism, an expression of an overpowering sense of crisis and nothingness, alienation and ennui, Promethean defiance and Sisyphean despair, and Coetsian horror and Kafkaesque angst. Many literary movements like symbolism, impressionism, imagism, expressionism, surrealism, cubism, futurism, vorticism, Dadaism, and existentialism flourished and made it possible to make the literature new. Before an analysis of the major trends in the modern literature is to be made, one has to be alive to the problem facing the modern writer. One of the major problems was that there is no commonly accepted, unified picture of man. To Freud, man is a biological phenomenon. To Marx, man is the outcome of social and economic forces. The Christian notion of man as the child of sin was no longer acceptable. So the despair of the 20th century man and the artist became acute.